Okay, so today I wanted to talk a little bit about 40K unit types. There's a couple different types of units, and they function differently and need to be treated differently. So let's get into it. First, there's two main categories, which is infantry and vehicles. The main difference, well, some of the differences between infantry and vehicles is that infantry have high OC, meaning that they're better holding objectives. Infantry can move through terrain and have a smaller table footprint, meaning that they take up a smaller amount of space on the table, which is quite nice. Uh, but infantry become less effective after losing models. As the unit takes casualties, they'll be able to deal less damage, be able to take less damage, and have worse OC, so it's a bit risky. Vehicles, on the other hand, can shoot into melee and tank shock, which, a shooting unit a shooting infantry unit is going to function a bit differently than a shooting vehicle unit because shooting vehicle units can still shoot in melee and tank shock, so they aren't really phased by melee and may actually want to get into melee. Vehicles have a large table footprint. This can be an upside and a downside depending on how you look at it. A large table footprint means that you are easier to target, you are more visible, and it's harder to hide, but you can also use larger table footprints to move block and prevent your opponent from really moving where move block. Uh, One more thing about vehicles is that they only get -1 to hit if they are injured, which means that a vehicle at low health is pretty much the same as a vehicle in high health, except that, meanwhile, infantry over here, they lose a lot of effectiveness after losing models. So a vehicle only getting -1 to hit, not that big a deal. A vehicle can take a hit and keep on trucking. Infantry, not so much. And vehicles have a chance to explode on death. This can be an upside or a downside depending on how you're using it. Generally, you don't want to keep too many units surrounding your vehicles, otherwise vehicle has a chance to explode and deal a bunch of mortal wounds to you. But if you charge your vehicle into the enemy and the vehicle explodes, then it's a good thing because now you're dealing mortal wounds to the enemy instead of yourself. It's just it's not really a good thing or a bad thing. It really depends on the context and how you play around it. Okay, but the main difference between infantry and vehicles is what damage types they're vulnerable to, because there's a bunch of different weapons in this game, and it can always be a little difficult to tell like what something is intended to kill. So, infantry. One thing that's really big in 40k is that there is no splash damage. One attack can only kill one model, which means that infantry are resistant against high damage weapons with few attacks. Uh, So, for example, a las cannon. A las cannon deals a fuck ton of damage, but it can only kill one infantry model. It can only kill one guardsman, which means that las cannons, while very, very powerful, are not that good at killing infantry. But infantry are vulnerable to weapons that are lower damage but have more attacks, though. So something like a heavy bolter is better at killing infantry than a las cannon, even though the heavy bolter has worse strength, worse AP, worse damage. These weapons that are better at killing infantry are called anti-infantry weapons because they are intended to kill infantry. You might also hear them being called small arms. When you hear somebody say small arms, think anti-infantry. Vehicles, on the other hand, are high toughness and have a high wound count. Uh, Anti-infantry weapons and small arms weapons will struggle to deal significant damage to vehicles. You might be able to chip off a wound, maybe two, maybe four, but you're not going to kill a vehicle with anti-infantry weapons unless you have like a ton of them, and even then, maybe not. But that said, vehicles are vulnerable to weapons with high strength and damage since they only have one model per unit. So they are very vulnerable to high damage weapons like las cannons, even though they're not vulnerable to weapons like heavy bolters. These weapons that are effective against vehicles but not effective against infantry are called anti-tank weapons. Yeah. So that's like the big main difference between the two. So when you look at a weapon in 40k, you should be looking at, is this an anti-infantry weapon or is this an anti-tank weapon? This is fairly simple, fairly easy. I feel like a lot of players will get this fairly naturally, but what's next up on the list is something that people might not get that easily. Is that we can take these two categories and break them down into a total of six, three each. There's light infantry, elite infantry, heavy infantry, as well as light vehicles, heavy vehicles, and super heavy vehicles. Uh, I don't know why the names change here a little bit. I didn't make this. I'm generally just, well, I did make the slide. I didn't really come up with these names. It's just sort of what the community has agreed on, I guess. Light infantry. Light infantry are the stereotypical what everybody thinks of when they think light infantry is your classic guardsman. T3, 5 up save, 1 wound each. It's very easy to kill one guardsman, but the problem is that there's almost never one guardsman. Guards Light infantry, one of the main strengths of light infantry is that they have a very, very, very high model count, which means that even some anti-infantry weapons will struggle to kill them because, sure, the anti-infantry weapon can kill a few models, but they won't be able to kill all of them. A good example of this is, like, let's say you're going to spend 200 points. If you spend 200 points on guardsmen, you're going to get about 30 guardsmen. If you spend 200 points on space marines, you're going to get about 10 space marines. If you spend 200 points on Terminators, you're going to get about 5 Terminators. So yeah, something that's good at killing 5 Terminators is probably not going to be good at killing 30 Guardsmen. Yeah. So next up, Elite Infantry. The most classic Elite Infantry that everybody thinks of is the Space Marine, or SEQ, which stands for Space Marine Equivalent. The reason why is that Space Marines are just iconic and super popular. Everybody runs Space Marines, so they've become the standout elite infantry unit, even though they're kind of on the heavier side of the elite infantry unit spectrum. Oh, I forgot to mention, if you hear the word GEQ being thrown around, that stands for Guardsman Equivalent. It just means a unit with a stat line of a Guardsman. And SEQ, Space Marine Equivalent, is a unit with the equivalent stat line of a Space Marine. And there's also TEQ, which is Terminator equivalent. Units with stats equivalent to that of a Terminator. Yep. The main difference between elite infantry, heavy infantry, and light infantry is that basically the further down you go on this list, the harder, like the more strength, AP, and damage it takes to kill them. But they make up for this by having a lower model count. So higher strength, AP, and damage, lower number of attacks needed. So it's kind of like a sliding scale. Again, just like kind of how there's a difference between infantry weapons, anti-infantry weapons, and anti-tank weapons, there is a difference between anti-light infantry weapons and anti-heavy infantry weapons. A good way to sort of gauge what a weapon is designed to kill for is to look at the weapon's AP. If a weapon has 0 AP, it's probably intended for light infantry. If a weapon has 1 AP, it's probably intended for either light infantry or elite infantry. If a weapon is AP2, it's probably intended for either elite infantry or heavy infantry. And if a weapon is AP3, then it's probably intended for either heavy infantry or vehicles. And if a weapon is AP4 or higher, it's definitely vehicles. So it's kind of like a sliding scale, kind of. I hope you're getting what I mean by this. And the thing is that you can kind of see, like, light infantry are kind of like the purest infantry. Super heavy vehicles are kind of like the purest vehicle, and either one of these is like, and all the ones in the middle are middle grounds. Like heavy infantry gains some of the traits of vehicles, but they lose some of the traits of light infantry. So it's it's like a sliding scale. How much of the infantry upsides do you want? How much of the vehicle upsides do you want? So yeah, vehicles. Yeah. What's noticeable about vehicles is that there isn't really distinct damage types for each class of vehicle. A weapon that's good at killing light vehicles will probably also be good at killing super heavy vehicles, although, yeah. Usually it's that light vehicles, heavy vehicles, and super heavy vehicles is their role is the role they serve. Light vehicles are usually serving roles that don't see direct combat or that don't want to engage in direct combat, like dedicated transports or long-range artillery weapons, or light vehicles that just give a buff to nearby friendlies. These light vehicles generally don't want to see direct combat and will usually try to pick their fights very carefully. And will try to, yeah, they're a bit difficult to use because you really got to position them well and be able to, again, pick your fights. But if you can, they can be really effective because you're paying less for a vehicle that doesn't need as much armor. Super heavy vehicles, on the other hand, they have a ton of armor, and you gotta use it. If you're paying for it, you gotta use that armor. So super heavy vehicles are always vehicles that are intended to serve on the front line, to be soaking up damage and to be dealing damage back. Like the classic super heavy vehicle is the Baneblade. Yeah. Uh, and then we have the heavy vehicles here in the middle. These guys serve sort of a middle ground between the light vehicle and the super heavy vehicle, where you kind of want to pick their fights, but at the same time, you have a bit more leeway with what fights they can take. So, heavy vehicles can stand up to some anti-tank fire, like super heavy vehicles, but they can't stand up to like a ton of it. Super heavy vehicles are so durable, it may be possible that your opponent just might not be able to kill them at all unless they dedicate like their entire army for several turns into killing them. But heavy vehicles, they don't get that luxury. So heavy vehicles are more durable than light vehicle. They can survive. Yeah. Like I said before, I guess it's really just down to heavy vehicles need to pick their fights, but they're a little bit more generous about what fights they can take. Meanwhile, light vehicles are very specific and they almost never want to take fights where they don't have an advantage. Yeah. This video is kind of rambly, unscripted, clearly, if you couldn't tell by now, but I hope this helped you out a little bit, because one thing I see a lot of new players struggle with is that they don't really understand the difference between, like, they understand the difference between infantry and vehicles, but they don't really understand the difference between each category of these subcategories, I guess. Because I'll see players use light infantry weapons against heavy infantry, try to kill Terminators with bolt guns. That's not going to work, because it's going to take like a ton of bolt guns just to deal a single point of damage to a Terminator. Meanwhile, light infantry are super easy to kill with bolt guns. It takes like 3 bolt gun shots just to kill 1 infantry. But Terminators, it's going to take like 80 bolt gun shots just to kill 1 Terminator, which is not really efficient. Again, AP is what I'd say is really what denotes what weapon is supposed to be used against what. So again, look at the AP, and that'll tell you what weapon, what unit is supposed to go into. These terms are also just very useful for just communicating with your opponent. You'll generally, if there's a unit on your opponent's side of the field that you don't know what it is and what it can do, you should ask your opponent, like, hey, what kind of unit is that, and what is it good at killing? So, for example, if you see Terminators on the other side of the field, your opponent might say, oh, Terminators are a heavy infantry unit that's good at killing elite and heavy infantry. That's good. Yeah, or if your opponent has something like Intercessors, they'll say, oh, it's an elite infantry unit that's only really good at killing light infantry. It's just like, this just really speeds up communication a little bit and helps you communicate more info with less words, because telling somebody, oh yeah, they're T4, 3-up save, 2 wounds each, and their weapons are like 2 attacks each, 4 strength, 1 AP, 1 damage, that's a lot of info, and it can be easy to get kind of lost in that. But just saying it's an elite infantry unit that can kill light infantry, that's very simple, very basic, communicates a lot very clearly. So I hope that this has helped you just a little bit when it comes to 40k strategy, because 40k is a very complex game, and every little bit helps. Okay. See you later.